Imagine being told you are saving your family. Imagine believing it just enough to get into the carriage, to walk down the aisle, to say the words. Now imagine the mask coming off and realizing the lie was so much bigger than one old man's face. That is exactly what happened to Laura Robert. And nothing, not one thing, was ever what it seemed. The drawing room smelled of old whiskey and older shame. Laura stood near the window, her hands loose at her sides, watching her father sign the document that would unmake her. His shoulders curved inward like a man already broken, no longer the proud, straight-backed figure who had once commanded a room simply by entering it. His hand trembled as he pressed the seal into warm wax. He did not look at her. Her mother stood by the cold fireplace, still, folded, a pale statue in a grey dress, and her lips pressed so thin they had nearly disappeared. She had not eaten properly in weeks. Laura had noticed. She had said nothing. Some silences were the price of survival. "You will marry the Earl of Blackhurst," her father said. His voice carried no weight anymore. It fell flat, like a coin dropped on stone. "The contract is signed." Laura turned from the window slowly. "Who is he?" Her mother's eyes dropped to the floor. "He is very old," her father said. 90 years, perhaps more. He is dying. He needs a wife before the title passes, before the estate is seized. He paused. "Our debts reach Parliament, Laura. If this marriage does not happen, we lose everything. The house, the name, everything." Laura looked at the two people who had raised her, who had taught her to read French by candlelight, to curtsy with grace, not to believe that a woman's worth was not a number on a ledger. She looked at them and understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that they had always been lying to her about that last part. "They say he wears a mask," she said quietly. Her mother's chin lifted. "He is a sick man. He values his privacy. They say no one has seen his face in 30 years. Laura," her mother's voice cracked, the first fracture in all that marble composure. "You are saving us." The room went very quiet. Laura thought of the young men who had once smiled at her at assemblies. Before the rumors began, before the money thinned, before her father's name became something people whispered rather than spoke aloud. She thought of what she had imagined for herself, a garden in spring, a man who chose her freely, and a life that was hers by right rather than arrangement. She let those images go. She watched them dissolve like smoke. "When does the carriage come?" she asked. Her mother's lips trembled. 3 weeks. Laura nodded once. Her voice did not waver, though something behind her ribs had gone very still, the way a candle goes still before it goes out. "Very well," she said. "I will marry him." The carriage arrived on a morning so grey it was almost colourless. Laura held her mother for a long moment before she climbed inside, breathing in lavender and something beneath it, something acrid and faintly chemical she could not name. Her mother was thinner than she had been a month ago, considerably thinner. She told herself it was grief. She would not understand the truth of that thinness until it was almost too late. What? She did not look back as the carriage pulled away. She had decided that the night before. Looking back would have undone her. The journey north took 4 days. The land changed slowly at first, then all at once, green fields surrendering to moors the colour of bruises, to skies that pressed low and heavy, to a silence so complete it had its own texture. Villages grew sparse, trees twisted sideways from years of wind. The air that seeped through the carriage windows tasted of iron and cold water and something faintly ancient, as though the earth up here remembered things it had no intention of sharing. Laura spent much of the journey watching the world narrow around her, wondering what kind of man needed a wife badly enough to buy one. Wondering what a dying earl wanted with a baron's daughter who had nothing left to offer but her name and her silence. On the fourth evening, the carriage stopped. She leaned forward and looked through the glass and felt the breath leave her body. Blackhurst Estate did not sit on the land so much as rise from it, as though it had been there long before England had a name and intended to remain long after. Stone towers, high arched windows lit from within by the pale flicker of candles, like eyes half open in the dark. The fog rolled in low from the moors and curled against the base of the walls as though it belonged there, as though it had always lived there. The carriage door opened. The cold hit her like a hand pressed flat against her chest. A woman waited at the top of the stone steps. Silver-haired, straight-backed, dressed in black, so deep it seemed to absorb the candlelight around her. Her eyes moved over Laura with the calm, measuring precision of someone cataloguing a purchase. "Miss Robert," she said. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. Her tone was permafrost. "I am the Dowager Duchess of Blackhurst. You will call me Your Grace. Welcome to the estate." Inside, the manor was extraordinary and entirely airless. Vaulted ceilings, dark panelling, tapestries so old their colours had bled into one another, beauty without breath, grandeur without warmth. Laura followed a maid through corridors that seemed to grow longer the further she walked, past doors that were closed, and she tested one quietly. Locked. The servants did not smile at her. They moved efficiently, spoke in undertones, and had the particular stillness of people trained never to react. Several of the men near the outer doors carried themselves with the posture of soldiers, straight, ready, watching. "You will meet your husband at the altar," the dowager said that evening over a supper Laura could not eat. "He does not receive visitors in his private rooms." "I am to be his wife," Laura said carefully, "not a visitor." The dowager looked at her for a moment, with something that might, in another face, have been pity. "No," she agreed. "You are not." That was all she said. The wedding gown appeared the following morning, ivory silk and intricate lace, beautiful and impersonal, fitted to her measurements precisely. Someone had known her measurements before she arrived. She filed that thought away in the growing collection of things she did not yet understand. The ceremony was at dusk. No guests, no flowers, no music, only candlelight. Dozens of candles along the altar rail and in iron stands against the walls, their flames bending and recovering in a draught that came from nowhere and everywhere. Shadows pooled in the corners and shifted. The priest stood at the altar with the expression of a man performing a ritual he had long since stopped asking questions about. And beside him, the groom. He was hunched into dark cloth, layers of it, shapeless and dense. A hood obscured his head. The cane he leaned on was carved black wood, and he moved it forward with each step in the rhythm of something running down. His breathing reached her before she reached the altar, labored, ragged. The sound of a body failing in slow motion. His face was a mask. Pale porcelain, smooth and featureless, shaped into the vague suggestion of a man, hollowed cheeks, now carved brow ridge, dark openings where eyes watched from somewhere in the shadow beneath, not grotesque in the way of wounds, grotesque in the way of absences, the wrongness of a face that was not a face, moving through candlelight, without expression, without age, without life. Laura walked forward. She stood beside him. She felt the cold radiating from his clothing, heard every labored breath, and held her own steady with the deliberate attention of a woman who had decided that composure was not weakness, but weapon. The priest began. Laura said what she was meant to say, in the clear voice she had promised herself she would maintain. She said, "I will," to a hooded figure with a porcelain face, and she did not flinch. The priest turned to the groom. There was a pause, a silence so complete the candlelight seemed to stop moving inside it. And then everything changed. The figure beside her straightened, not slowly, all at once, sudden, fluid, controlled, a movement that sent cold up Laura's spine. The cane struck the stone floor and the sound rang like a gunshot, and several candles guttered and nearly died. The dowager in the front pew did not move. The priest went absolutely still. Two hands, between, broad, scarless, entirely young, reached up to the porcelain mask. The mask came away. Laura's breath stopped. The face beneath was not ruin, not age, not the slow collapse of a dying man. It was a face of sharp angles and dark eyes, and a jaw set hard as the stone walls belonging to a man of 25, with dark hair and eyes the exact color of a winter sky before a storm. He stood at full height, tall, broad-shouldered, controlled, entirely alive. And he looked at her without apology and without theatre. The chapel was completely silent. He stepped closer. Close enough that she felt the warmth of him, cedar and cold air, and he bent his head so his mouth was near her ear. And he said, very quietly in a voice meant only for her, "I am not Henry Gillian." A breath. "I killed him this morning." Laura did not move. She held her bouquet with both hands and looked straight ahead at the crucifix above the altar and thought with the peculiar clarity of catastrophe. Of course the lie had layers. Of course she had walked in believing the worst was already named and found instead that the worst had not yet introduced itself. She turned her head and looked at him. He looked back. Those winter sky eyes, steady and unreadable, watching her absorb it. "To finish the ceremony," she said to the priest. Her voice did not shake. The priest swallowed and continued. When it was done, Julian took her hand with the formal deliberateness of a man establishing terms and led her out of the chapel into the dark corridor beyond. Laura walked beside him through the cold stone passage and thought about Henry Gillian, apparently dead, and about the organization that had built an entire fiction around his existence, and about what it meant that the man beside her had ended that fiction with such specific, timed precision. The death had been sanctioned, the servants had not panicked. The dowager had attended the ceremony as planned, which meant she had not been bought by a desperate criminal. She had been acquired by a machine, and the machine had been running long before she arrived. And she filed this in the place behind her eyes where she kept everything that would eventually be useful, and she paid attention. Welcome back, my dear romantics. Before we enter tonight's tale of whispered vows and stolen glances, be sure you're subscribed, leave a like, and tell me where you're listening from. I love seeing our historical romance family spread across the world. Every comment and bit of support keeps these stories of scandal, duty, and desire alive. So settle in. Let the world fade away. And now, let us begin. The morning of the ceremony, Laura Robert was dressed like a display piece prepared for viewing. Not in grief, in silk, ivory silk that whispered against her dark skin as the dowager's maids layered it over her shoulders with the practiced, impersonal efficiency of women who had dressed many brides and felt nothing about any of them. They pinned her hair with ivory combs. They pressed white roses into her hands. They stepped back and assessed her the way a painter assesses a finished canvas, looking not at her, but at the effect of her. She was 22 years old, tall, with the kind of quiet beauty that people noticed slowly and then could not stop noticing. Deep brown skin that caught candlelight and held it, dark eyes that missed nothing, a mouth that had learned in recent years to stay still even when her mind was screaming. She stood in the center of the dressing room while strangers arranged her for a ceremony she had not chosen, and she breathed steadily because steadiness was the only currency she had left. She had been replaying the previous evening since she woke, the cane hitting stone, the mask coming away, the face beneath it, young, sharp, winter sky eyes completely without apology. His voice against her ear. I am not Henry Gillian. I killed him this morning. She had said, finish the ceremony to a trembling priest, and she had meant it entirely. She had married a lie with full knowledge that it was one, and she had done so with her voice steady and her hands still, and she understood there was something in that, something she could use. The dowager arrived at 4:30. She stood in the doorway in unrelenting black, silver hair pinned to architectural precision, her gaze moving over Laura with measuring calm, not unkind exactly, but entirely without warmth, the attention of someone who has assessed many people and found most of them wanting. You will walk in silence, the dowager said. You will not ask questions at the altar. Any agitation is dangerous to the proceedings. Laura held her gaze. He is not your grandson, she said quietly. Is he? The dowager looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in her eyes, not surprise, but the fractional acknowledgement of someone who has underestimated the distance a person can travel in a single night. Walk in silence, the dowager said, and then very quietly, so quietly it was almost not said at all, and be careful whom you trust in this house, including me. She turned and left. Laura stood with that for 3 seconds, then she followed. The chapel was attached to the eastern wing, old enough that the stone had gone soft at the edges, the carved faces above the doorway worn by centuries into expressions of ambiguous suffering. Inside, the air was cold and close, carrying old stone and extinguished candles, and something beneath, something medicinal and sharp that did not belong in a place of worship. No guests, no flowers, no music, only candlelight. Dozens of candles along the altar rail and in iron stands, their flames bending and recovering in a draught that moved without apparent source. Shadows pooled and shifted. The priest stood at the altar with the expression of a man who had decided, some time ago, not to ask questions about this particular family. And beside him, the groom. Hunched into dark cloth, a hood obscuring his head, at the carved black cane, bearing his weight with each labored step. His breathing preceded him, wet, ragged, the sound of a body in its final negotiations. His face was pale porcelain, smooth and featureless, shaped into the suggestion of age, hollowed cheeks, carved brow ridge, dark openings where eyes watched from somewhere in the shadow beneath. Grotesque, not in the way of wounds, but in the way of absences. A face that was not a face. Laura walked forward and stood beside him, and looked straight ahead at the crucifix and breathed with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who had decided that composure was not weakness, but the only weapon she currently possessed. The priest began. Laura said her vows in a clear voice. She said, "I will," and she did not flinch. The priest turned to the groom. The pause arrived. 3 seconds, perhaps less, but dense enough to have texture. Then the figure beside her straightened. All at once, the cane struck stone like a gunshot. Several candles guttered. The dowager in the front pew did not move. The priest froze. 2 broad, scarless, entirely young hands reached up and tore the porcelain mask away. Laura forgot how to breathe. 5 and 20, dark hair. A jaw cut hard as the stone walls, eyes the precise color of a winter sky in the hour before a storm. Cold, clear, absolutely alive. He stood at full height, and he was tall and broad-shouldered, and there was not a single molecule of illness in him. He looked at her. The chapel held its breath. He stepped close. Cedar and cold air, and bent his head to her ear. "I am not Henry Gillian." A breath. "I killed him this morning." Laura did not move. She held her bouquet and looked at the crucifix and thought, of course the lie had layers, of course the worst had not yet introduced itself. She turned her head and looked at him. He looked back, those winter eyes steady, watching her absorb it with the attention of a man who has built something and is waiting to see whether it holds. "Finish the ceremony," she said to the priest. Her voice did not shake. The priest swallowed and continued. When it was done, Julian took her hand. Formal, deliberate, the contact of obligation, and led her from the chapel. The dowager followed at a distance that was not coincidental. Laura walked beside her husband through the cold stone passage and thought about what she now knew and what she still didn't. And she understood that the distance between those 2 things was where everything dangerous lived. She had entered this chapel as currency. She was leaving it as something the people in this house had not yet correctly identified. She intended to keep it that way. He did not kiss her. He took her hand at the altar's end with exactly the required pressure and released it the moment the study door closed, putting solid mahogany between them with the deliberateness of a man establishing perimeters. Dark wood, locked drawers, a fireplace burning with aggressive utility rather than comfort. Laura stayed near the door. She looked at him across the room and felt 2 things simultaneously, a fury so clean it was almost clarifying, and beneath it, something she refused to examine yet. "Henry Gillian," she said. "The real one. Tell me who he was." Julian met her gaze. A liability. 11 years inside the operation, long enough to know everything, long enough to start drinking, to manage the weight of it, recently enough to start talking. He paused. "There is a faction within this organization that wanted him gone before he destroyed what they had built. I was the instrument of that decision. His death was sanctioned. That is why the house did not react. That is why the dowager attended the ceremony without blinking." Laura absorbed this. Not murder from without, execution from within. Which meant Julian was not a rogue agent operating against this organization. He was trusted enough to be used for something irreversible. The distinction mattered. "You faked your death 6 years ago," she said. I was 17 when I disappeared. I needed to build a position inside the cabal from below, close enough to dismantle it, trusted enough not to be watched too carefully. He moved from behind the desk, not toward her, but to the side, removing the barrier without closing the distance. "I am close to the people who run it, close enough to end it if I am not exposed before I can act. And a wife with no connections cements your cover. A wife who is clever enough not to make mistakes is the difference between success and a very quiet death for everyone involved." He held her gaze. "Including you?" She heard the threat in that. Not cruelty, logistics, and filed it alongside everything else. "And if I go to a magistrate?" "The cabal dissolves before it can be dismantled. 50 members vanish to the continent with their names intact. And you would not reach the village gate." The fire settled. Laura breathed in once, slowly. "Then we understand each other," she said. She found her mother's letters 3 days later, inside the lining of her traveling trunk. The inner seam, re-stitched with thread that didn't match, found by fingers searching for a missing glove. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before she opened them. Her mother's handwriting. That familiar, deliberate script. Every loop controlled, every line perfectly straight. As though even in private correspondence she could not permit herself the dishonesty of a natural slant. 4 letters, 3 addressed to someone identified only by initials. The 4th, a clinical summary in her mother's hand. Quantities, dates, effects. Laura read them all. Then she sat with the letters on her knees and the afternoon light coming grey through the high windows, and she understood several things at once. Her mother had not been skipping meals out of poverty. The thinness, the pallor, the careful distance, Laura had read all of it as guilt. The complicated sorrow of a mother selling her daughter without another way. She had been wrong. The letters documented a sustained, methodical administration of a botanical compound, slow-acting, cumulative, introduced into her father's food and drink over months, not to kill him, to fog him, to strip his mind of its sharpest edges and leave behind something that would sign documents without examining them too closely. Her father had not simply failed, he had been made to fail. And the payment in the 3rd letter was substantial enough to represent not desperation, but ambition. Her mother had not sold her to escape poverty. She had sold her daughter to a criminal organization for a sum that would sustain her comfortably for the rest of her natural life. Laura folded the letters carefully and placed them inside her bodice, against her skin. Then she put her face in her hands, and she wept. Not for long, not with abandoned grief, but with the specific private tears of a woman who has loved someone completely and discovered that love was the mechanism of her undoing. She gave herself exactly as long as it took the light in the window to shift. Then she dried her face, straightened her spine, stood up. She went downstairs and told Julian what she had found, not the letters, those she kept, the substance of them, delivered in the same level tone he used with her, watching his face as she spoke. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the only change in his expression was a slight tightening at the jaw. "You already knew," she said. "I suspected your father's signature was inconsistent with a man operating under full capacity. Your mother's involvement was arranged through a third party I had not yet fully traced. You used his diminished state to secure the contract." "Yes." The word fell between them cleanly, without defense. Laura looked at him. This man who would not perform innocence he didn't possess, and felt something move through her chest that was more uncomfortable than anger. Understanding, which has the cruelty of arriving before you are ready for it. "Then we are both in a house of liars," she said. "Yes," he said. "And the only honest people in it are each other." He was quiet for a moment. "That is what I intend," he said. The performance began the following week. Every evening at the long table, Julian at the head, Laura at his right, the dowager at the far end with her assessor's gaze, moving between them with the patience of a woman who had been reading rooms for decades. The servants circled with the noiseless efficiency of people, trained to be furniture and the alertness of people whose actual job was surveillance. Laura catalogued them quietly, which rooms they guarded most consistently, which hours they shifted patterns, which corridors they avoided and why. She said nothing of this to Julian. She was not yet certain whether the information was for him or for herself. The courtship, such as it was, consisted of calibrated gestures. Julian refilled her glass before she asked. She laughed once, genuinely, surprised into it by something dry he said about the portrait gallery, and saw him register it with an expression that moved too quickly to name. She touched his arm when she needed to speak quietly, her dark fingers against the fabric of his sleeve for the duration of a sentence and no longer. He held her chair. She thanked him in the tone that suggested intimacy without confirming it. All performance. She kept knowing this, kept reminding herself in the quiet of her room that every shared glance was architecture, not feeling. She was building a convincing marriage alongside a man she had known for 11 days in a house full of people whose job was to find and exploit fractures. She kept knowing it. The knowing, however, had begun to require more effort than it had in the first week. The library was on the second floor, high shelves requiring a rolling ladder, a fireplace along the south wall, 3 chairs near the windows overlooking the moors. Laura went there in the mornings. She read English inheritance law with the specific intention of understanding exactly what she had been made party to. She mapped the estate room by room in her mind, using what she had seen and what she had quietly deduced. Julian found her there on a Tuesday morning. She was reaching for a volume on the upper shelf, just out of reach, the tips of her fingers brushing the spine, when she heard him enter. She did not lower her arm or step back. She stretched further, which did not help. And then he was beside her, not behind her, close enough that she was acutely aware of his warmth along her left side, the height of him. He reached past her with easy reach and placed the book in her outstretched hand. He did not step back immediately. The moment lasted perhaps 4 seconds, long enough for the nearness of him to register as something other than logistics, the cedar and cold air scent of him, the particular silence of 2 people standing very close without touching, the warmth of the book in her hands from his grip. Long enough for something to move in the air between them, unasked and unanswered. Then he stepped back. 1 pace, clean and deliberate. "Thank you," Laura said. Her voice was level. He looked at the spine of the book she held. English inheritance law, chosen with complete intention. The guarded, reluctant respect moved through his expression again. Sensible reading," he said. "I am a sensible woman," she replied. She sat down and opened the book, and was aware of him settling into the chair by the window, and was aware, with an irritation that was also something else entirely, that the room felt different with him in it, less like a hiding place, more like somewhere something might eventually be said. She read her inheritance law and said nothing about this. She found the room 2 days later, not by searching, by following a draft, a cold thread of air moving along the lower corridor of the east wing in a part of the house the servants' routes didn't cover in the evenings. An irregularity. She followed irregularities. The door was behind a tapestry, old oak, iron-banded, unlocked, which was itself the most frightening thing about it. Not hidden, accessible. Either no one expected anyone to find it, or it had been left for the right person to find at the right time. She pushed it open and went down the stairs anyway. The room at the bottom was large, stone-floored, lit by a single oil lamp on a central table, burning with a steady, purposeful flame. Someone had left it burning. She knew with cold certainty that this was the second possibility. She moved further in. The walls were lined with shelves, and on the shelves, row upon row, stacked with the precision of a collection, were masks. Porcelain masks, identical porcelain masks. Hundreds of them, pale and blank and smooth, each bearing the same suggestion of aged features. Hollow cheeks, carved brow ridge, dark eye openings. Each slightly different in degree of wear, some pristine, some faded at the cheekbones, some with thin cracks along the jaw carefully repaired, used, maintained, replaced, stored with the organized care of a company's accounts. Laura stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. Not one man, not two. The Earl of Blackhurst, the dying, masked, ageless Earl, was a role, a position, occupied by a succession of young men, each trained to maintain the illusion, each eventually replaced, the porcelain face remaining constant, while the human face beneath it changed. She picked one up, light and cool in her dark hands, the painted lines of age delicate as brushwork on fine china. She turned it over. Inside, in ink, faded to brown. Thomas Crane, 1801 to 1809. She set it down. There had not been an Earl of Blackhurst, not a real one, for perhaps a century. The title was a shell. The immortal dying nobleman was a performance designed to keep a building full of secrets, perpetually protected by the fiction of an aristocrat, too frail to be questioned and too old to be challenged. She was not married to an earl. She was married to the latest in a line of performers, and the performance had been built to contain something far more valuable than land. Behind her, a footstep on the stairs. Julian stood at the base with a candle. He looked at her, at the mask she had just replaced, at the room, swept once with his gaze, then back at her. "How long have you known about this room?" she asked. "Since I arrived." "You left the lamp burning?" "Yes." She held his gaze across the room, surrounded by the empty porcelain faces of every man who had worn this lie before him, and felt something she would not name yet, something that lived in the specific weight of being the only two people in a room full of masks who were showing each other their actual faces. "Tell me everything," she said. He set the candle on the table beside the lamp. The doubled light pushed the shadows back. And he began. Silas Gillian arrived on a Thursday morning without announcement, which was the point. Laura was in the garden, frost-hardened ground along the south wall, bare rose canes against the stone, gravel crunching under her boots in the cold air. She walked here when the house became too dense with watching, and she used the time to memorize the estate's outer geography with the same systematic patience she applied to everything inside. She was not a woman walking circles, she was a woman building a map. She heard the carriage before she saw it, the crack of wheels on the drive, the percussion of a team pulled to a stop. She did not go inside immediately. She stood and listened and waited, because moving too quickly towards something she didn't yet understand felt, in this house, like a mistake. When she came in through the garden door, Silas was already in the entrance hall. She saw him from the top of the servants' stair, her preferred vantage, invisible from below, commanding the full hall. He was broad-shouldered, perhaps 50, with the kind of presence that preceded him like weather. Silver at his temples, a coat that had been expensive long enough to have softened into authority. He moved with the confidence of a man who had spent decades in rooms where fear was the atmospheric condition and had stopped noticing it. And he smelled even from 2 floors above, of expensive tobacco and something beneath it that registered at some instinctual level as wrong. Too sweet, the sweetness of something that would sicken you if you came too close. "Where is he?" Silas said, not asking, pronouncing. The dowager stood in the center of the hall, spine as straight as the walls. "The Earl is resting." The Earl, Silas said, the two words carrying precise and terrible weight, has been resting for 30 years. The Dowager said nothing. In her silence, Laura read something she had not seen from her before, the specific effort of a woman managing the presence of someone she feared and would not let see it. Silas looked around the hall with the slow survey of a man establishing territorial claim. His gaze moved up the staircase along the gallery. Then it stopped at the servants' stair where Laura stood. She did not step back. She held his gaze from 2 floors above with the full composure she had been building since London. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. The most frightening thing she had yet seen in this house. Not cruel exactly, but empty of every quality that would have made it human. A calculation that had arrived by some internal route at the shape of charm. The new Countess, he said. How unexpected. Julian found her in the library that afternoon. He came in quickly, which was unusual for a man who had made deliberate unhurry into discipline. "You have met him," he said. "In the hall." Laura closed her book. "He looked at me the way people look at things they haven't decided whether to keep or discard." Julian sat across from her. And without the armor of the dinner table, she could see the tension in him more clearly. The set of his jaw, the specific stillness of a man holding something close, because releasing it would be dangerous. "His name is not Silas," Julian said. "It is Henry Gillian, the true Earl of Blackhurst." The fire breathed between them. "He is your brother," she said. "He is my brother." His voice was level, but she was learning to hear what lived beneath it. "The man I was sent here to destroy. He established the dying Earl fiction to protect the counting house. He created the cabal, funded it, has been running it from behind the mask of a dying man while presenting himself to the world as the grieving, dispossessed younger brother." A pause. "I faked my own death 6 years ago to infiltrate his organization from below. He has never recognized me, but I was 17 when I disappeared. I look different now." Laura looked at him, the sharp angles, the jaw that had grown into something new in the years between a boy's disappearance and a man's return. "Different enough," she said. "Barely," he said, and she heard the cold edge beneath it, the chill of a man living one false step from catastrophe. "He came to confirm the Earl narrative is intact before he moves whatever comes next," Laura said. "Yes. And if he suspects you, he will not leave witnesses." Julian held her gaze. "Including you." The fire settled. Outside, the moors pressed grey and limitless against the estate walls. She thought about the mask room, about the rows of identical faces, about her mother's letters pressed against her skin, about Julian beside her, ghost, strategist, liar, our husband, who had shown her more honesty in 4 weeks than anyone she had known. She thought about Silas in the hall below, looking up at her with his terrible smile and his wrong-smelling coat and the eyes of a man deciding. "Then we need to move before he does," she said. Julian looked at her, and in his expression she saw something unguarded, something that had not had time to be controlled back behind its walls. "Yes," he said quietly. "We do." Outside, the wind moved across the moors and pressed against the library windows, and somewhere below in the locked corridors of Blackhurst Estate, the counting house breathed on, patient, cold, and full of secrets that were finally beginning to surface. Silas requested the formal dinner. That alone should have been warning enough. In the 3 days since his arrival, he had moved through Blackhurst Estate with proprietary ease, touching things, opening doors that stayed closed for everyone else, watching Laura with that smile that never reached the intelligence behind his eyes, impeccably, dangerously polite. and now he wanted them all at table, candlelit, performing the fiction of a family at peace. Julian agreed without hesitation. Laura understood why. Refusing would have been a tell. She dressed carefully, dark green silk that deepened the rich brown of her skin, hair pinned at the nape with ivory combs, pearl earrings at her ears. She studied herself in the mirror before going down and noted that she looked composed, like a woman who belonged here. She did not feel like one. She felt like a woman standing on ice she could hear cracking. The dining room was fully lit for the first time since her arrival, every candelabra burning, the long table laid with the estate's silver, crystal throwing cold arcs of light across dark paneling. Silas stood near the fireplace with a glass already in hand, dressed in deep charcoal, watching her cross the room with the appreciation of a man inspecting something he commissioned. Julian was already seated. His eyes found hers as she came in, brief, private, carrying information she had learned to read. "Be careful." She gave him the fractional nod that meant she already was. The dinner proceeded. Course after course, conversation maintained in the register of people performing normalcy over an abyss. Silas was charming the way very dangerous things are charming, but the charm wasn't incidental to the threat, it was the mechanism of it. And for the final course, Silas produced a bottle of deep burgundy he had carried from his own travelling case, opened it with ceremony, and filled Julian's glass, then Laura's, then set the bottle down without filling his own. He raised an empty glass. "To the new Countess of Blackhurst," he said, "and to the continuation of the Gillian line." They drank. The wine was extraordinary, complex and dark, with a finish that lingered like the aftertaste of something expensive. Silas set his empty glass down and looked at them both with the comfortable patience of a man who has already won. "I should mention," he said pleasantly, "that I did not fill mine." The candlelight continued its indifferent performance. A log shifted in the fireplace. The compound is botanical, slow-acting, tasteless at the concentration I used per tête. 3 sentences, economical, precise. There is an antidote. The cipher, to locate it, is in the estate's original foundation plan. The surveyor's marginalia. You have until dawn. He rose. He straightened his coat. He looked at Laura one final time with that empty architectural smile. "Do try," he said. He left. Julian was on his feet before the door had fully closed. The composure he had maintained through weeks of this fractured, for the first time, into something urgent beneath the surface. He looked at Laura and she looked back, and neither of them wasted a breath on the obvious. "The estate office," she said, already moving. "Lower East Corridor. Will it be locked?" "Yes." He was beside her in the corridor. "I can open it." She kept pace with him, gathering her skirts in one fist to free her stride. He said the cipher is in the surveyor's marginalia, specific enough to be deliberate. He is not trying to kill us without an audience. He is testing how we operate. Julian glanced at her. "You extracted that from one toast." "I extracted it from 3 weeks of watching him watch us." She held his gaze briefly. "He stages things, the mask room, the lamp. He wants to observe the response." That guarded, reluctant respect moved through his expression. He said nothing. He led her through the dark. The estate office was locked. Julian opened it in under a minute with a tool produced from his coat without explanation. She noted this and said nothing. A man who carries lockpicks in a house like this has spent 6 years surviving it. The foundation plan was in the third plan chest, not hidden, stored. My Laura unrolled it on the office table while Julian held the candle, and she found the surveyor's marginalia in the lower right corner. Numbers interspersed with notations that appeared to be measurements until she applied the counting house logic Julian had been teaching her for weeks. East Tower, she said. Third level, north-facing wall. They ran. She felt it on the second staircase. A faint heaviness behind her eyes, a subtle unsteadiness at the edge of her balance, subtle enough to miss, if she hadn't been paying, the specific attention of someone who knew to look for it. She said nothing and kept running. She could see Julian compensating too. The gait of a man managing something his body was doing that he would not permit to show. The East Tower's third level was a storage room. Laura found the seam in the north wall paneling with her fingers, running them along the edges with the focused patience she had used on her trunk lining, and Julian found the mechanism, a brass fitting disguised as a coat hook, and the compartment opened. 2 glass vials sealed with wax, one marked with a single line, one marked with 2. Julian took them both. He looked at them, then he held the single marked vial out toward her. "That is the stronger dose," she said. She had read the cipher notation. She knew. "Yes. You are symptomatic before I am. Laura." Her name in his mouth for the first time without formality. No careful distance, no title. Just her name, quiet and undefended. His hand was not entirely steady. "Take it." She looked at him. In the tower darkness, moonlight, cold through the narrow window, on his face was stripped of every performance. What remained was a man who was frightened. Not for himself, she understood with a clarity that moved through her like warmth through cold stone, but for her. The specific, unmanageable fear of someone who has discovered, without having arranged to, that another person has become necessary. She took the vial. She did not look away from him as she broke the seal and drank. He broke his own and drank, and they stood in the storage room at the top of the East Tower with the antidotes moving warm through their blood. And the silence between them was so full, it had weight and shape and a temperature that was nothing like the cold of the tower walls. She would think about that silence for a long time afterward, about what had been alive in it, what had been. About the moment she had understood, not as performance, not as architecture, that whatever existed between them had stopped being convenient some time ago, without either of them having the sense to notice. She did not say this. He did not say it either. They went back down the stairs, and the house breathed around them, and Silas's test had produced a result he had not anticipated. They had solved it together, and in the solving had become something neither of them yet had a clean word for. Laura found the nursery by following silence. Not the ordinary silence of unused rooms, the particular silence of a space actively maintained in stillness, kept quiet the way you keep a secret, with effort and intention. She had been moving through the upper floors in the days following the poisoned dinner, and she had noticed it in the corridor behind the tower staircase, a density of quiet that was not natural. The door was unlocked. She opened it. The room was warm. Warmth in a house that ran cold everywhere, from a small fire burning behind a guard in the grate, recently laid and recently tended. A fire someone had come in and lit not long before she arrived. The second thing was the rocking horse. Painted white with a red saddle, real horsehair worn smooth along the neck from years of small hands. Around it, a low bed with a deep blue quilt, a shelf of books with spines facing out, a doll in a small chair dressed in a gown the precise color of the dress Laura had worn to her own 7th birthday. Small boots beside the door, polished. A nightgown pressed and waiting on its hook. A child had been placed here, and she felt the distinction before she could articulate it. The difference between a room that had gathered the debris of an actual childhood and a room constructed to represent one. This had been built. Furnished with specific knowledge, she moved to the shelf, a volume of illustrated tales, a child's name written inside in the careful, just-learning script of a young hand. Eliza, a pressed flower, fell from between the pages, flat and brown and fragile, the kind a child preserves because the world still gives flowers the weight of monuments. Laura held it for a moment. Then she went to the small writing desk beneath the window and opened the lower drawer. She stood with her hand on the brass pull and looked at the moors below and thought, some information cannot be unlearned. Then she opened it. Genealogical records, medical assessments, our formal correspondence. She sat in the child's chair and read, and as she read, the warm room became something else. Not comfort, but evidence. The fire in the grate, a signal that someone had known she was coming, had staged this too, had left it burning. The Gillian syndicate had been planning for longer than one generation. The records traced her bloodline backward through 4 generations, annotated with notations she recognized from her inheritance law reading. The crown inheritance the counting house protected was not financial. It was biological. A royal grant issued in obscurity a century ago, tied to a specific genetic succession that had been tracked, managed, and... She found the word and felt the floor shift. Cultivated. She was not here by accident. Her father's debt had not been accident. Her mother's machinations had not been individual ambition. She had been bred, selected over generations, the specific, required, irreplaceable biological key to a crown inheritance worth more than the estate, more than the counting house, more than everything the cabal had spent a century protecting. Eliza's name in the book. The pressed flower, the gown, the color of Laura's 7th birthday. The child looked exactly like her. She understood this without needing to see her, because the child had been made to. She was still sitting in the small chair, the flower in her dark hands, when the door opened behind her. Ruth came in quietly, carrying a candle. Her usual expression, soft-eyed, warm, the face of a woman who had spent years making herself easy to overlook. She set the candle on the shelf and turned, and in the moment of turning, the softness became insufficient as a disguise, like thin cloth over something edged. What emerged beneath was sharp, contained, completely in command. "You read quickly," Ruth said. Her voice was the same. Everything was the same except the part that had been pretending. Laura set the document on the desk. She did not stand. "How long?" she asked. "How long have I led the syndicate?" 15 years, since the previous leader made the mistake of underestimating his secretary. A pause. "They always underestimate secretaries." "And the recordings," Laura said. She had understood in the past 30 seconds what had been happening in her room every evening. Not a device, a person. The silent girl who came each evening to bank the fire, moving through the room with the noiseless efficiency of trained furniture, and whose actual job was to remember every word and deliver it to Ruth each morning in careful shorthand. Every thought Laura had spoken aloud in the apparent privacy of her own room. Every confidence, every calculation she had not yet shared with Julian. She had never been alone. "Enough to make 3 cabinet ministers very uncomfortable," Ruth said pleasantly. "And the crown itself, with what you said last week about Julian's true identity." She looked at Laura directly. "You didn't know you were confiding. That is precisely the point." Laura thought about every warning Ruth had offered her. Every gentle piece of intelligence steered her way. The night visitor, the mask room, the estate's strangeness. All of it designed not to help her, but to manage her. To keep her moving towards specific discoveries and away from this tower, for as long as possible. The kindness had been architecture. The warmth had been the most precisely deployed weapon in the building. "What do you want?" Laura asked. "Your signature on a legal claim that restructures the inheritance of 3 titles and a substantial portion of the royal treasury. Your blood completes it. Your cooperation makes it clean." Ruth held her gaze. "Or I release what has been recorded. Julian is exposed, the cabal disperses, and you spend the rest of your life as the woman who was too proud to secure her own future." Laura looked at her. This woman whose hands had dressed her hair, whose warmth had been a weapon, whose every kindness had been a calculation. And she felt something that was not quite fury and not quite grief, and was perhaps the specific emotion that exists in the space between them, but the feeling of having extended trust with care and having it used with equal care against you. "I will need time to consider," she said. Ruth nodded. "By morning. After that, the offer changes." She took her candle and left. Laura sat in the child's chair and held Eliza's pressed flower and thought about power and what it cost. Then she stood, made her second decision, quiet and absolute, and went to find Julian. On her way through the tower corridor, she stopped at Eliza's door, looked at the small boots beside it, and the nightgown pressed and waiting, and understood that some things she was carrying out of this building, regardless of what burned. The fire started in the east wing. Laura smelled it first. A thin thread of smoke working under her door at an hour when the household should have been breathing in the deep rhythm of sleep. She was already awake, still dressed, sitting at her window assembling everything she knew into the shape of a plan. The smoke made the plan urgent. She was in the corridor in under a minute, but before she moved toward the east wing, she went up. To the tower. The nursery fire was burning low. Eliza was asleep in the blue-quilted bed, small, dark-haired, with a face that was Laura's face at 8 years old, made into a separate person, breathing with the absolute trust of a child who did not yet know what had been done to bring her into existence. Laura stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. Then she went in, gathered the child with practiced gentleness, and carried her into the corridor where the dowager was already standing. The dowager looked at the child in Laura's arms. Something moved through her face, not surprise, but the particular grief of a woman who has been living alongside a wrong thing for so long that she has been waiting without articulating the weight even to herself for someone else to move first. "Take her to the north wing," Laura said. "Away from the fire. Keep her there until this is finished." The dowager looked at her for a long moment. Then she took Eliza, carefully, with the specific tenderness of a woman who had once been someone's grandmother before she became a machine of the estate. And she went. Laura ran. Julian met her at the east staircase. Shirt sleeves, no coat, his expression confirming what she already knew. "Ruth and Silas moving together," he said. "The vault first," Laura said. "Everything that ends this is in that vault." He looked at her for 1 second. Then he moved. The counting house corridor was thick with smoke, heat building in the walls, the air at the edge of unsurvivable. Laura tore the side panel from her skirt as they ran, soaked it from a basin in the antechamber, pressed one half to her face, and handed the other to Julian without breaking stride. He took it without comment. They moved through the smoke, with their heads low and their eyes streaming, and Laura felt the burn of it in her lungs and kept moving because stopping was not a choice she was prepared to make. The vault door was heavy iron. Julian worked the combination with both hands, steady despite the smoke and the heat and the structural sounds of the manor losing its argument with the fire. The vault opened. Inside, shelves of documents, ledgers, correspondence, the paper skeleton of a century-old conspiracy. On the highest shelf, the Crown inheritance records. On the center table, Ruth's shorthand transcripts. 3 thick notebooks, every word Laura had spoken in her room preserved in careful hand, and the genealogical records from the nursery. Julian moved for the high shelf. Laura moved for the center table. She heard it before she saw it, the low, structural groan of a ceiling giving way and the sound of something releasing above. She looked up. Julian said her name. Sharp, immediate, and she moved left on pure instinct, and the beam came down directly where she had been standing. It caught Julian across his left shoulder and upper back and drove him to one knee with a force that was not glancing. She heard the sound it drove from him. Involuntary, uncontrolled. The only sound he had made in weeks that he hadn't governed, and it moved through her cleaner and deeper than anything in this building had managed. She was across the vault in 3 steps. "The documents," he said, white-faced, completely controlled in everything except the line of his body. "Take them and go." "Stop talking," she said. "Laura, you held out the stronger vial in that tower," she said, assessing the beam with her hands, reading the weight and angle of it. "I was not going to leave you then. This is consistent." Something moved through his face. Not the guarded respect of the library, not the careful warmth of the dinner table. Something rawer than both, something that had been building under all of it for weeks, and had not found its moment until now. I'm in a burning vault with smoke in their lungs, and everything they had been building toward either saved or lost in the next 30 seconds. She braced her shoulder under the beam's edge and pushed. The sound he made when the weight shifted was the price she paid for it, and she paid it without hesitation, and she pushed until the angle changed and got her arm under his and pulled. He came free in a stumble. She caught with her whole body, his weight against her, her arm across his back where the beam had struck, his forehead dropping briefly to her hair, and his breathing unsteady at her temple. One moment. Just one. The smoke moving around them both. Everything they had not said existing in the space between breaths, present and acknowledged without being named, neither of them pretending any longer that it wasn't there. She selected 3 documents, not all 3. The Crown inheritance record, the master accounts, Ruth's transcripts, fast and well, because survival was not about having everything. It was about having the right things. They came out of the counting house as the room behind them found its full combustion. Julian was moving on his own, not cleanly, but sufficiently, and she kept her hand on his arm because she was not letting go. Silas and Ruth were at the south door, a carriage waiting outside. Ruth with a traveling case. Silas with his coat and his composure and his terrible smile. Julian stopped in the corridor and looked at his brother. The smile stayed, but the architecture behind it shifted, as though a wall had moved inside a building and the facade had not caught up. He looked at Julian. He looked at Laura. At the documents in her hands, the torn skirt, the soot on her cheekbone, and the steadiness in her dark eyes. He drew breath. Laura said, "The shorthand notebooks contain a verbatim record of every conversation Ruth's operative transcribed in my room, including the evening you told her your London contacts by name." She held his gaze without heat, without theatre. "You trusted her completely. That was your mistake." Silas looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at the floor. The authorities arrived at the front of the house. In the chaos of running feet and shouted orders, both doors opened simultaneously from the outside. Silas turned and found the corridor behind him occupied. He looked at Julian one final time, his younger brother, his ghost, the instrument he had sharpened for 6 years. Without understanding, he was sharpening it against himself. And neither of them said anything because everything between them had already been said in 6 years of architecture, and none of it could be taken back. They were taken. Laura and Julian stepped back into the north side of the house and found a room with a window facing the moors. They sat on the floor with their backs against the wall, his shoulder against hers, the documents between them, the sounds of the manor's dismantling reaching them, filtered through stone. Outside, Blackhurst Estate burned in its eastern quarter and stood in its western quarter, and the moors absorbed the light of it without comment, with the patient indifference of land that has outlasted every human urgency placed against it. Julian's breathing was careful, Laura's was careful. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Julian said, "I have to die. Again." She turned her head and looked at him. If Julian Gillian lives, there are questions neither of us can answer without cost. His eyes were on the window. If Julian Gillian dies in the fire, the line is extinct. The inheritance resolves under the documents you hold, and you are free. He paused. Free and powerful enough to finish what we started. Laura was quiet. The fire breathed outside. "And you?" she said. "Someone who chooses his own name for the first time." He looked at her now. In the firelight from the window, his face was open in a way she had never seen it. No mask, no strategy, nothing held back. Someone who has somewhere to go, if she is willing. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the carriage north and the chapel and the cane hitting stone, about the vial held out in an unsteady hand at 3 a.m, about a beam and the sound of him and her shoulder under the weight of it, about a child in a blue quilted bed who had no name yet that was entirely her own. "Then you had better be convincingly dead," she said. Something in his face, the last held thing, finally eased. "America," he said. She looked back at the window, at the moors, dark and vast, burning on one side and standing on the other. "Then America," she said. 6 months later, Laura Robert, the Countess of Blackhurst, the widow of Blackhurst. The woman the London papers described with adjectives that oscillated between formidable and terrifying, depending on the writer's political alignment, entered the royal ballroom at precisely 9 o'clock. She wore black silk, not mourning black. There was a distinction, and she had dressed it deliberately. Mourning black is apologetic. What she wore was declarative, deep and rich against the warm brown of her skin, cut with the severe confidence of a woman who had stopped performing anything for anyone. Her hair was dressed high, with a single ornament. A pale ribbon threaded through the arrangement and suspended from it at her collarbone. A small porcelain mask. Old, smooth, blank. Carried from the basement of Blackhurst Estate the night the eastern wing burned, she wore it the way a soldier wears a medal, the way a survivor wears a scar. Those 6 months had not been gentle. She had spent the first week in a solicitor's office. Plain dark dress, 3 documents on the table, a clarity of purpose that the solicitor, a man of 50 years' experience, described afterward to his clerk as one of the most focused minds he had encountered in his professional life. The Crown inheritance claim was filed within a fortnight. The Blackhurst title and its London properties transferred to her within 6 weeks, through legal channels that the syndicate's own carefully cultivated parliamentary connections made, in the end, more efficient than they had intended. She had performed grief throughout all of it. Black dress, lowered eyes at appropriate moments, the dignified composure of a young widow managing a great estate. Every morning she had risen and dressed in mourning for a man she knew was not dead, and understood, in the quiet of evenings alone in the Blackhurst London house, that the grief was not entirely false. She had mourned something. The weeks before Silas arrived, when the house had been dangerous, but the danger had been theirs together. The silence in the tower, the vial held in an unsteady hand. She had worn black for 6 months for a man she knew was alive. And it had been the only honest thing she did in London. Because grief was exactly what she felt, and for reasons she had never, at the beginning of any of this, expected. The room noticed her entry the way rooms notice things that cannot be comfortably ignored. A ripple moved through the assembled lords and ladies, that particular social current that precedes a reckoning. She had spent 6 months becoming fluent in this room's language, its hierarchies, its pressure points. The Earl of Pemberton was near the windows with his 3rd glass. She stood beside him and spoke 4 sentences in a tone that carried no heat and no hurry, and watched the colour leave his face with the particular totality of a man discovering that the room he thought he was standing in has walls that don't go where he believed. Lord Ashcroft received a sealed letter via his secretary in the corridor outside the retiring room. By the time he opened it, she was across the ballroom. The Marquis of Renford, primary financial architect of the cabal's parliamentary access, identified in the master accounts by name and figure and date over 12 years, she approached directly in the center of the ballroom floor, and in a voice calibrated to carry precisely as far as it needed to. The accounts from Blackhurst's lower vault detail 12 years of payments from your office to a revolutionary organization with connections to the Crown's treasury and military supply chain, she said, conversationally, almost warmly. The investigating committee has had them for 3 weeks. I believe you received a letter this morning. She held his gaze. I would suggest leaving before the dancing begins. He set down his glass. He left the room. She did not smile while she did any of it. This was not triumph. It was completion. The finishing of something begun the day a carriage came to a grey London morning and took her north into a life she had not chosen. Her father was escorted to the Tower 2 days later. She had written him 1 letter, a single page, precise and without cruelty, explaining what she had found in the trunk lining, what his signature had cost, and what it had ultimately produced. She sent it and did not send another. Her mother's exile was processed at the end of the month. Laura received the notification at her writing desk in the morning light and held it for a moment, thinking about lavender and chemical bitterness, and arms around her at a carriage door and a whisper, "You are saving us." She set the notification down. She let it be what it was. She booked passage to America on a Tuesday, under a name invented for the purpose. She booked 2 cabins, one for herself, one for a child traveling as her ward under a new name, Eliza Robert. Given the night before departure in the quiet of the Blackhurst London house, while the child slept and Laura sat beside the bed and understood, with a certainty that needed no ceremony, that some families are not inherited, they are chosen at cost in the full knowledge of what the choice means. The ship was called the Meridian. It left Portsmouth on a morning of pale winter sun, the kind of day England occasionally produces in January, as though by accident, sharp and clear and briefly, improbably beautiful. Laura stood at the rail as the coast diminished and felt the salt air move through her hair, and thought about the woman who had stood at a window watching rain trace thin lines down glass while her father signed the document that was supposed to unmake her. She had not been unmade. Eliza stood beside her, small and warm against her side, watching England recede with the focused interest of a child for whom the world is still primarily composed of things that have not yet been explained. She had been told in careful language that they were going somewhere new, that her name was her own now, and that the woman beside her was not going anywhere without her. She had accepted this with the practical trust of a child who has been given, for the first time, something real to hold on to. Laura found the cabin below and knocked twice, the way they had arranged. The door opened. He had no mask, no disguise beyond a plain coat and worn boots. The clothes of a man who had chosen them for himself rather than any role. His dark hair was slightly longer. There was a quality about him she saw in the first 2 seconds, the quality of a man who had finally, after a very long time, stopped holding himself in the posture of someone bracing for the next threat. He looked at her. He looked at Eliza beside her. Something moved through his expression. Surprise! And then something warmer than surprise, acknowledging the full weight of the choice Laura had made without requiring it to be explained. "Julian," she said. Then, because they had come far enough, "Just Julian." "Just Julian," he agreed. He looked down at Eliza. "Hello." Eliza looked up at him with the frank, assessing gaze of a child who has learned not to trust easily and is deciding whether this case warrants revision. "You have a scar on your hand," she said. "I do," he said. "How did you get it?" "A very long story," he said. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I like long stories," she said. Hammond walked past him into the cabin with the decisive air of someone who has found what she was looking for and is ready to settle in. Julian looked at Laura. Laura looked at him. She came inside. He closed the door and the sound of the sea filled the room. Constant, impartial, entirely indifferent to the history they had carried aboard. She stopped an arm's length away, that same distance they had been maintaining in one form or another since the altar, close enough that the warmth of him reached her before she did. She crossed it. His hand came up and touched her face, her cheek, the line of her jaw, the angle of her cheekbone, the way you touch something you have been afraid to damage by wanting too much. His thumb was careful and certain, and she felt the touch move through her, the way warmth moves through cold stone. Slowly, completely, reaching places that had been closed a long time. She put her hand against his chest over the plain fabric of his coat and felt his heart. Steady, real, present. His left shoulder held a slight stiffness beneath her palm, the body's memory of a beam and a vault and a woman who had chosen not to leave. She did not comment on it. She simply knew it, the way you know the particular geography of someone who has become necessary to you without your having arranged for it. He bent his head. She lifted hers. What happened next was not the ending of anything. It was the beginning. Unhurried and certain, lit by pale light through the porthole, witnessed only by the Atlantic stretching wide and entirely open beyond the glass. Behind them, Eliza was already investigating the cabin's drawers with cheerful, methodical intent, and the small sounds of a child making herself at home in a new world. When the sun began its descent hours later, a long Atlantic sunset burning copper and amber and deep, impossible, rose over a horizon with no English fog, no locked doors, no porcelain masks. Laura stood at the porthole with Julian's hand warm in hers and Eliza asleep in the narrow bunk behind them, breathing with the absolute trust of a child who has found her people. They had lost their titles. They had shed their names. They had walked away from everything that had been arranged for them and carried out only what had proven. in fire and dark corridors and a beam and a tower and a silence full of things that didn't need to be said to be real. The sun found the water. The water held it. The ship moved on. Ship